The year is 1587. Elizabeth Tudor sits on the throne of England, her realm beset by Catholic conspiracies and foreign threats. But the greatest danger to her crown lies not in distant Spain or Rome, but in a castle in Northamptonshire, where a woman who has already lost one throne now threatens to claim another. This is the story of how Marie Stuart, Queen of Scots, became ensnared in a web of espionage so sophisticated it would make modern intelligence agencies envious. It is a tale of double agents, coded letters hidden in beer barrels, and a spy master whose network stretched across Europe. But above all, it is the story of betrayal on a scale so monumental that it would end with the first judicial execution of an anointed European monarch and change the course of history forever. To understand the betrayal that sealed Mary's fate, we must first understand the woman who became its victim. Marie Stuart, Queen of Scots since she was 6 days old, had already lived a life that read like a Gothic romance novel gone wrong. Crowned as an infant, raised in the French court, widowed young, remarried to her own cousin Lord Darnley in a match that quickly turned poisonous, then widowed again under circumstances so suspicious they destroyed her reputation. When Darnley was found dead in mysterious circumstances in 1567, blown up in a house that showed signs of strangulation rather than explosion, Mary's involvement became the subject of intense speculation. Her hasty marriage just 3 months later to the Earl of Bothwell, the man widely suspected of Darnley's murder, sealed her political doom in Scotland. The Scottish lords had seen enough. They rose in rebellion, forcing Mary to abdicate in favor of her infant son James. But Marie Stuart was not a woman to accept defeat gracefully. After a failed attempt to reclaim her throne through battle, she made the fateful decision that would define the rest of her life. On May 16, 1568, she crossed the Solway Firth in a fishing boat, fleeing to England and throwing herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth. She believed that one queen would surely help another regain her rightful throne. Instead, she had just walked into a prison that would hold her for 19 years. Elizabeth faced an impossible dilemma. Mary's presence in England was like keeping a lit stick of dynamite in the throne room. As a Catholic with a legitimate claim to the English throne through her descent from Margaret Tudor, Henry VII's daughter, Mary automatically became the focus of every Catholic plot against Elizabeth's Protestant regime. The situation became exponentially more dangerous in 1570, when Pope Pius V issued his devastating papal bull, Regnans in Excelsis. This document didn't merely excommunicate Elizabeth, it declared her deposed, released her subjects from any oath of allegiance, and essentially declared open season on the English Queen. Every Catholic in England was now caught between their loyalty to their sovereign and their loyalty to Rome. For many, Mary represented the solution to this agonizing choice. Elizabeth's response was to keep Mary under house arrest, moving her between various English castles and manor houses, never allowing the two queens to meet face to face, despite Mary's repeated requests. This isolation was both a security measure and a psychological torture. Mary, accustomed to being the center of power and attention, found herself reduced to writing endless letters pleading for her freedom, for armies to restore her to Scotland, for anything that might end her captivity. It was this desperation that would eventually make her vulnerable to the most sophisticated entrapment operation of the Tudor age. The architect of Mary's downfall was Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's principal secretary and the man history remembers as her spy master. Walsingham was a Puritan, a man who saw the conflict between Protestant England and Catholic Europe in stark religious terms. To him, Mary was not just a political problem, but a spiritual threat, the instrument through which Catholic powers sought to return England to what he saw as papal darkness. But Walsingham was also a pragmatist who understood that Elizabeth would never willingly execute an anointed queen without ironclad legal justification. He needed to catch Mary red-handed in treasonous activity, and he was prepared to wait years for the perfect opportunity. Walsingham's intelligence network was revolutionary for its time, employing methods that wouldn't become standard practice until the 20th century. He maintained agents across Europe, from the courts of Spain and France to the seminaries where English Catholic priests were trained. He used double agents, intercepted correspondence, broke codes, and employed what we would now recognize as agent provocateurs. His annual intelligence budget was enormous by Tudor standards, and he frequently spent his own money to maintain his operations. He understood that information was power, and he was determined to know everything that might threaten his queen and his Protestant England. The web began closing around Mary in 1585 when she was moved to Chartley Hall in Staffordshire, ostensibly just another change of residence in her long captivity. What Mary didn't know was that Walsingham had orchestrated this move specifically to facilitate a new method of communication that he could control completely. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. The key figure in this operation was Gilbert Giffard, a young English Catholic who had been studying for the priesthood in Rome. Giffard appeared to be the perfect recruit for Catholic conspirators. Well-educated, religiously motivated, and with impeccable Catholic credentials. In reality, he was Walsingham's agent, either turned during his time abroad, or possibly working for English intelligence from the beginning. Giffard approached Mary's supporters with a proposition. He had developed a secure method for smuggling letters to and from the captive queen. The method was ingenious. Letters would be sealed in waterproof packets and hidden inside the hollow bung of beer barrels. The local brewer, who delivered ale regularly to Chartley Hall, was supposedly sympathetic to Mary's cause and willing to help. What the conspirators didn't know was that the brewer was also in Walsingham's pay. Every letter that went into those beer barrels was first copied by Walsingham's agents. The copies went to Thomas Phillips, Walsingham's codebreaker, who had already cracked the cipher that Mary and her correspondents were using. The originals were then resealed and delivered as planned, maintaining the illusion of security while ensuring that Walsingham could read every word. For months, Walsingham watched and waited as Mary's correspondence flowed through his hands. She wrote to Catholic supporters across Europe, to agents of Philip II of Spain, to anyone who might help her escape or regain her throne. Most of these letters were treasonous in content, but they lacked the specific evidence that Walsingham needed. He was looking for something more dramatic, more conclusive, more undeniably treasonous. He was waiting for someone to propose the assassination of Elizabeth, and for Mary to agree to it. That someone turned out to be Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman from Derbyshire who had developed a romantic fascination with the imprisoned Scottish queen. Babington had been a page in the household of the Earl of Shrewsbury during one of Mary's earlier periods of captivity, and he had conceived what could only be described as a chivalric obsession with rescuing her. He was exactly the kind of idealistic, impractical young man that Walsingham's agents could manipulate. The Babington Plot, as it came to be known, was ambitious in scope and amateurish in execution. The plan involved 6 separate elements: the assassination of Elizabeth, the rescue of Mary, a general uprising of English Catholics, the invasion of England by a foreign Catholic army, the placing of Mary on the English throne, and the restoration of Catholicism in England. It was the kind of grand conspiracy that appealed to romantic young men who had read too many tales of knight-errantry and not enough accounts of political reality. Babington gathered around him a group of like-minded young Catholics, each assigned specific roles in the conspiracy. John Ballard, a Catholic priest, was to coordinate with foreign powers. John Savage was designated as one of Elizabeth's assassins, having apparently volunteered for the role during a meeting in a Paris tavern. Chidiock Tichborne, despite being only 24 years old, was to help organize the general Catholic uprising. The group met regularly, often in taverns, discussing their plans with an openness that would have been suicidal if they had realized how thoroughly Walsingham had penetrated Catholic networks in England. What made the Babington Plot perfect for Walsingham's purposes was not just its ambition, but its specific targeting of Elizabeth. Previous Catholic plots had focused on freeing Mary or supporting foreign invasion, activities that were treasonous but might not provide clear grounds for executing a queen. But assassination of the reigning monarch was unambiguously treasonous, and anyone who consented to such a plot would be equally guilty under English law. The crucial moment came in July 1586 when Babington wrote directly to Mary, outlining the entire conspiracy and asking for her approval. His letter, delivered through Gifford's beer barrel postal system, was a detailed exposition of the plot. He outlined the plan for Mary's rescue and the foreign invasion that would follow. Most importantly, he asked for Mary's explicit consent and blessing for the entire enterprise. Mary's response, written on July 17, 1586, was everything Walsingham could have hoped for. Rather than rejecting the assassination plot with horror, as a truly innocent queen might have done, Mary engaged with it in detail. She expressed concern about the practical aspects of the conspiracy, questioning whether the promised foreign army was real rather than imaginary, and emphasizing the need for her to be rescued quickly once Elizabeth was dead. But she did not reject the fundamental premise of assassination. Instead, she wrote that once the deed was carried out, she must be freed immediately. Her phrasing was careful, but her meaning was clear. She consented to Elizabeth's murder. When Thomas Philippes decoded Mary's reply, he was so excited that he drew a small gallows on the letter next to Mary's words. After months of patient surveillance, Walsingham finally had the evidence he needed. Mary had not merely failed to report an assassination plot. She had actively encouraged it, providing detailed advice on how it should be carried out. Under English law, this made her as guilty of treason as if she had wielded the assassin's dagger herself. But Walsingham was too careful an operator to spring his trap immediately. He added a postscript to Mary's letter before it was delivered to Babington, asking for the names of the 6 men who were to kill Elizabeth and details of how foreign forces would be landed in England. This addition, forged in Mary's cipher, was designed to extract even more incriminating evidence from the conspirators. It was a masterpiece of agent provocateur tactics, using Mary's own words to encourage the conspirators to provide even more detailed evidence of their treason. The trap was now fully baited, and the conspirators walked into it with tragic predictability. The plot began to unravel in August 1586 when John Ballard was arrested. Under interrogation, he revealed details that led to the arrest of other conspirators. Babington initially tried to flee, but he was captured in Harrow, reportedly hiding in a barn with his hair cut short and his skin stained with walnut juice in a pathetic attempt at disguise. The trial of the Babington conspirators was swift and brutal. They were convicted of high treason and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the traditional punishment for traitors. The first group, including Babington and Ballard, was executed on September 20th, 1586. The public nature of their execution was deliberately horrific, designed to demonstrate the fate that awaited those who plotted against the crown. Contemporary accounts describe the crowd's reaction to the savage brutality of the punishment as so negative that Elizabeth modified the sentence for the second group of conspirators, allowing them to hang until dead before the drawing and quartering began. With the conspirators dead, attention turned to Mary herself. The evidence against her was overwhelming, but executing a queen, even a deposed one, required careful legal preparation. Elizabeth was acutely aware that she would be setting a dangerous precedent. If an anointed monarch could be judicially murdered, what protection did any ruler have? The decision to try Mary was not taken lightly, but the evidence of her involvement in the assassination plot made it politically impossible to ignore her treason. Mary was moved to Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire for her trial. The choice of venue was symbolically significant. Fotheringhay was the birthplace of Richard III, the last English king to die violently, and its remote location would prevent any rescue attempts while limiting the number of witnesses to the proceedings. The castle itself was a massive Norman fortress, built on a motte beside the river Nene, its great hall providing a suitably dramatic setting for the trial of a queen. The trial began on October 14, 1586, with Mary facing a commission of 46 English nobles, bishops, and legal officials. She was denied legal counsel, not permitted to review the evidence against her in advance, and forbidden from calling witnesses in her defense. These restrictions, while legally justified under English treason law, ensured that the proceedings would be more of a political ritual than a genuine legal contest. Mary conducted her defense with considerable skill and dignity, despite the legal disadvantages she faced. She denied knowing Babington or Ballard personally, challenged the authenticity of the letters attributed to her, and argued that as a foreign queen, she was not subject to English treason law. Her performance was impressive enough that one English lord reportedly voted for acquittal, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence was too strong, and the political necessity too great. The most damaging moment came when Mary's own secretaries, Claude Now and Gilbert Curley, testified against her. Under pressure and possibly torture, they confirmed that the letters presented in evidence were genuine and had been dictated by Mary herself. This betrayal by her own most trusted servants was perhaps the cruelest cut of all. These men had served Mary faithfully for years, had shared her captivity and her hopes for freedom. Their testimony removed any remaining doubt about her guilt and completed her isolation. Mary was convicted of treason on October 25, 1586, but her execution required Elizabeth's signature on a death warrant. This Elizabeth was extremely reluctant to provide. The Queen understood better than anyone the precedent she would be setting. If monarchs could be judicially executed for treason, then no throne in Europe would be truly secure. She also feared the reaction of other European powers, particularly Mary's son James VI of Scotland, who might seek revenge for his mother's death. The pressure on Elizabeth to sign the death warrant was enormous. Parliament petitioned her repeatedly, her councillors urged swift action, and Protestant preachers declared that God demanded Mary's death. Finally, on February 1, 1587, Elizabeth signed the warrant, though she would later claim that she never intended for it to be delivered to Fotheringhay without her further approval. The execution was scheduled for February 8, 1587, just 1 week after the warrant was signed. Mary was informed of her fate on the evening of February 7th, giving her barely 12 hours to prepare for death. She spent those final hours in prayer, writing her will, distributing her possessions among her servants, and composing a final letter to King Henry III of France. Throughout the night, the sound of hammering echoed through the castle as workmen constructed the scaffold in the great hall. The scaffold itself was a carefully designed stage for royal death. It was draped entirely in black cloth, raised about 2 feet off the ground, and reached by 2 or 3 steps. On it were placed a block for the execution, a cushion for Mary to kneel on, and 3 stools for Mary and the 2 earls who would witness her death. The choice to hold the execution indoors, rather than in a public square, was deliberate. It limited the number of witnesses and prevented the creation of a public spectacle that might generate sympathy for the condemned queen. On the morning of her execution, Mary dressed with careful attention to symbolism. She wore a black gown over a red petticoat, the red being both the liturgical color of martyrdom and the heraldic color of royalty. Over her graying hair, she wore an auburn wig that concealed her true appearance and maintained her royal dignity. Around her neck, she carried an Agnus Dei, a small wax medallion blessed by the Pope, marking her as a faithful Catholic to the end. Mary's final performance was masterful theater, a carefully choreographed demonstration of royal courage and Catholic faith. She walked to the scaffold with dignity, assisted by her servants, and showed no signs of fear. When the commission for her execution was read aloud, she listened calmly, occasionally objecting to particular phrases, but never challenging the proceedings' legitimacy. The execution itself was botched in a manner that added to both the horror and the legend. The executioner's first blow missed Mary's neck entirely, striking the back of her head and causing her to cry out softly while continuing to pray. The second blow severed most of her neck, but left sinews attached, requiring the executioner to use his axe like a knife to complete the decapitation. When he finally lifted the head to show the assembled witnesses, Mary's auburn wig came away in his hand, revealing her gray hair and causing the head to fall to the scaffold floor. But perhaps the most poignant detail of all was the discovery of Mary's small Skye Terrier, which had hidden beneath her skirts throughout the execution and refused to leave her body. The dog, reportedly named Geddon, had to be forcibly removed from the scaffold and died shortly afterward, unable to survive the loss of its mistress. The immediate aftermath of the execution revealed the authorities' awareness of Mary's potential for martyrdom. Everything that had been touched by her blood was carefully collected and either burned or thoroughly washed. The executioner and his assistant were given money and sent away immediately, not allowed to keep any souvenirs that might become relics. With Mary's fate sealed by the Babington Plot, the final preparations for her execution began to unfold with chilling precision. The months following her trial at Fotheringhay Castle were filled with political maneuvering as Elizabeth the Earl wrestled with the momentous decision of executing an anointed queen. The weight of this choice cannot be overstated. Never before had an English monarch ordered the execution of a fellow sovereign, and Elizabeth understood that such an act would send shockwaves throughout the royal courts of Europe. The political calculations were staggering. Elizabeth feared the reaction of Catholic Europe, particularly Spain and France, where Mary's execution could be seen as a declaration of war against Catholic monarchy itself. She worried about her own Catholic subjects, who might view the killing of a Catholic queen as a sign of Protestant tyranny. Most concerning of all, Elizabeth feared establishing a precedent that could one day be used against her own crown. If queens could be executed for treason, what protection did any monarch truly have? Yet the pressure from Parliament and her Privy Council was relentless. They argued that Mary's continued existence posed an unacceptable threat to the realm. As long as she lived, she would remain a focal point for Catholic conspiracies and foreign invasion plots. The Babington Plot had proven that Mary was willing to consent to Elizabeth's assassination, making her not just a political prisoner, but an active threat to the Protestant settlement of England. After weeks of agonizing deliberation, Elizabeth finally signed the death warrant on February 1, 1587. The document was immediately dispatched to Fotheringhay Castle, carried by riders who understood the gravity of their mission. Elizabeth would later claim that she had not intended for the warrant to be sent so quickly, punishing those responsible for its dispatch. Whether this was genuine regret or political theater to distance herself from the decision remains a matter of historical debate. The choice of Fotheringhay Castle as the execution site was deeply symbolic. This ancient Norman fortress had been the birthplace of Richard III in 1452, connecting it to the violent history of English royal succession and the Wars of the Roses. The castle's remote location in the Northamptonshire countryside made it secure from any potential rescue attempts, while its association with royal births and deaths gave the proceedings an air of historical inevitability. On the evening of February 7, 1587, Mary was informed that she would be executed the following morning. The news was delivered by the Earl of Kent and other officials, who found her calm and composed despite the shocking announcement. Rather than breaking down or pleading for her life, Mary spent her final hours in prayer and preparation, displaying the dignity that would characterize her final moments. Mary's last night was spent in the small chapel within Fotheringhay Castle, where she prayed continuously and wrote her final letters. Her correspondence to King Henri III of France, brother of her first husband, Francis II, was particularly poignant. In it, she portrayed herself as a martyr for the Catholic faith, dying for her beliefs rather than any real crime. She also wrote her will, carefully distributing her few remaining possessions among her loyal servants who had shared her 19 years of captivity. Throughout the night, the sound of hammering echoed through the castle as workmen constructed the scaffold in the great hall. Mary could hear every blow of the hammer, each nail driven into wood, marking another step toward her death. Yet witnesses reported that she remained remarkably calm, spending the hours in prayer and meditation. At 2 a.m, she lay down on her bed but did not sleep, instead listening to the ominous sounds of her execution platform being built. The scaffold itself was a carefully designed stage for royal death. Constructed in the center of the Great Hall, it stood approximately 2 feet high and measured 12 feet square. The entire structure was draped in black cloth, creating a somber theatrical setting that emphasized the gravity of the proceedings. 3 stools were placed on the platform, 1 for Mary and 2 for the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, who would serve as official witnesses. A wooden block and cushion completed the grim furniture of execution. The decision to hold the execution indoors rather than in a public square was deliberate. By limiting the number of witnesses and controlling access to the event, the authorities could manage the narrative and prevent Mary's death from becoming a public spectacle that might inspire Catholic sympathizers. The Great Hall could accommodate only a select group of observers, ensuring that the execution would be witnessed but not celebrated or mourned by large crowds. On the morning of February 8th, Mary rose early and dressed with particular care. She chose to wear a black gown with a white veil, the traditional garb of a Catholic widow. Beneath this somber exterior, she wore a bodice and petticoat of deep red silk, the color of Catholic martyrdom. This hidden crimson would create a dramatic visual impact when revealed at the moment of her death, transforming her execution into a powerful symbol of religious sacrifice. Mary's request to have her servants accompany her to the scaffold was initially denied by the execution officials, who feared that her attendance might create a disturbance or attempt to interfere with the proceedings. However, Mary's dignified insistence on her royal prerogatives eventually prevailed. She reminded the officials that she was cousin to Queen Elizabeth, descended from Henry VII, a former Queen of France, and an anointed Queen of Scotland. Such a person, she argued, could not be expected to die alone without proper attendance. After some negotiation, Mary was permitted to choose 6 of her most loyal servants to accompany her to her death. She selected her physician, her surgeon, and 4 of her most devoted ladies-in-waiting. These faithful attendants had shared her captivity and would now share her final moments, providing both practical assistance and emotional support as she faced her execution. The procession to the Great Hall was a study in contrasts. Mary walked with dignity and composure, her bearing regal despite the circumstances. She was escorted by the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, along with other officials and guards. The small group of witnesses who had been permitted to observe the execution were already assembled in the hall, creating an atmosphere of tense anticipation. As Mary entered the Great Hall and saw the black-draped scaffold, she remained outwardly calm. She listened as the death warrant was read aloud, formally announcing her crimes and sentence. When asked if she had any final words, Mary delivered a brief speech in which she protested her innocence of any crime against Elizabeth while acknowledging her Catholic faith. She forgave her enemies and prayed for Elizabeth's soul, displaying a grace that impressed even her executioners. The most dramatic moment came when Mary began to disrobe for her execution. Her servants helped her remove her black gown, revealing the crimson bodice and petticoat beneath. The sight of this blood-red garment sent a shock through the assembled witnesses, who understood its symbolic significance. Mary had chosen to die dressed as a Catholic martyr, her clothing making a statement that her words could not. As her ladies-in-waiting removed her jewelry and outer garments, Mary remained calm and composed. She distributed small gifts among her servants, giving them tokens to remember her by. Her composure was remarkable, displaying none of the terror or desperation that might be expected from someone facing imminent death. Instead, she seemed almost serene, as if she had already accepted her fate and found peace in her faith. The executioner, nervous about the historic nature of his task, asked Mary for her forgiveness. She granted it readily, even giving him a small payment as was customary. This gesture of forgiveness toward the man who would end her life was seen as another mark of her Christian character and royal dignity. She was determined to die as she had lived, with grace and nobility intact. Mary's final moments on the scaffold were carefully choreographed. Her voice was steady and clear, carrying throughout the silent hall. As she placed her head on the block, she continued to pray, repeating the words, "In manus tuas, Domine," "Into your hands, Lord," echoing the final words of Christ on the cross. The execution itself was botched in a manner that added horror to an already tragic scene. The executioner, perhaps nervous about his historic task, missed his mark with the first blow. Instead of severing Mary's neck cleanly, the axe struck the back of her head, causing her to cry out in pain. The second blow cut through most of her neck but failed to complete the job, leaving some sinew and flesh still connecting her head to her body. Only the third blow finally severed her head completely, ending her suffering. However, in a moment of dark comedy that would become part of the legend surrounding Mary's death, the head separated from the hair and fell to the ground with a thud. Mary had been wearing a wig to conceal her thinning gray hair, and the executioner found himself holding an auburn hairpiece while Mary's actual head rolled across the scaffold. This macabre moment of unintended comedy was followed by an even more poignant discovery. As the officials began to remove Mary's body from the scaffold, a small dog emerged from beneath her skirts. The little creature, described as a Skye terrier named Geddon, had somehow hidden itself in Mary's clothing and accompanied her to the scaffold. The dog refused to leave its mistress's side and had to be forcibly removed from the scene. The animal reportedly pined away and died shortly after, unable to survive without its beloved owner. The immediate aftermath of the execution was carefully managed to prevent the creation of Catholic relics. Every item that had been touched by Mary's blood was either burned or thoroughly washed. The executioner and his assistant were paid their fees and sent away without being allowed to keep any memento of the historic event. This systematic destruction of potential relics demonstrates the authorities' awareness of Mary's martyrdom potential and their determination to prevent her death from inspiring Catholic devotion. Mary's body was subjected to an autopsy before being embalmed and placed in a lead coffin. Her entrails were buried secretly within the grounds of Fotheringhay Castle, while her body was kept in storage until a suitable burial could be arranged. Elizabeth had refused Mary's request to be buried in France, insisting instead that she be interred in England. Eventually, Mary was buried in Peterborough Cathedral in a Protestant service, a final insult to her Catholic faith. The European reaction to Mary's execution was one of shock and outrage. Across the continent, printers published pamphlets describing the events at Fotheringhay Castle, often portraying Mary as a Catholic martyr who had died for her faith. These publications helped establish the romantic legend of Mary, Queen of Scots, that would endure for centuries, transforming her from a failed monarch into a symbol of tragic beauty and religious devotion. In Spain, Philip II used Mary's execution as additional justification for his planned invasion of England. The Spanish Armada, launched in 1588, was portrayed partly as a mission to avenge the Catholic Queen's death. Though the invasion failed, Mary's execution had succeeded in uniting Catholic Europe against Protestant England, fulfilling Elizabeth's worst fears about the international consequences of her decision. The destruction of Fotheringhay Castle in the decades following Mary's execution seems almost symbolic of the desire to erase the memory of that terrible day. The ancient fortress, which had witnessed the birth of kings and the death of queens, was allowed to fall into ruin and was eventually demolished completely. Today, only earthworks and a small pile of stones mark the site where one of history's most dramatic executions took place. Mary's death marked the end of an era in European politics. The execution of an anointed monarch for treason established a dangerous precedent that would eventually be used against other royal figures, including Charles I during the English Civil War. The concept of divine right monarchy, which held that kings and queens ruled by God's will and could not be judged by earthly courts, had been shattered by the events at Fotheringhay Castle. The betrayal that led to Mary's downfall was complete and systematic. Francis Walsingham's intelligence network had penetrated every aspect of her life, turning her own servants against her and transforming her secret correspondence into the evidence that would condemn her. The sophistication of this espionage operation, with its use of double agents, code-breaking, and psychological manipulation, represented a new level of state surveillance that would become the norm in following centuries. Mary's story resonated far beyond the immediate political consequences of her death. Her dignity in facing execution, her forgiveness of her enemies, and her unwavering faith transformed her into a romantic figure who captured the imagination of poets, playwrights, and novelists. The image of the beautiful, tragic queen who died for love and faith became a powerful symbol that transcended the harsh political realities of 16th century Europe. The betrayal of Mary Queen of Scots was not just personal, but institutional, representing the triumph of Protestant statecraft over Catholic monarchy, of intelligence gathering over royal privilege, and of political necessity over personal loyalty. Her execution at Fotheringhay Castle marked the end of medieval notions of royal immunity and the beginning of a new era in which even crowned heads could be held accountable for their actions. So there we have it, the final moments of Marie Stuart, a life that began with a crown and ended with an executioner's axe. Her story serves as a stark reminder that even queens are not immune to the brutal realities of political ambition and religious conflict. The woman who once ruled Scotland with grace and dignity met her end not through any grand battle or noble sacrifice, but through the calculated machinations of those who saw her as a threat to their power. In death, Marie Stuart achieved something that had eluded her in life. She became a martyr whose legacy would outlive all those who conspired against her. History would remember not just the betrayal and blood of that February morning, but the courage of a queen who faced her final moments with the same regal bearing that had defined her tumultuous reign.